My name is Jodie Whitney, Jodiewhitney.
Literature, trade magazines, newspaper articles, a lot of written material on the citrus industry. But we want to try to get a little bit more, talk to people who are involved in the industry and get some personal stories to go along with what's written. So that's our objective, to try to do this. And so I thought that mechanical harvesting would be a great topic to talk about. You've done an absolutely remarkable job of documenting videos, pictures, and the literature of what took place. I'd like to try to go behind the scenes and talk a little bit about some things that aren't in the literature, and some people. Jim Simpson, for example, is in the Hall of Fame, and Jim built a harvester, and I'm stumbling across people that like Bill Baker yesterday that told me his dad took a motor and a fan out of a speed sprayer and stuck it on a pallet box on a forklift. And what we want to try to do is get some of these stories. And a lot of the people are gone, but some of them are still around. And so I want to just have us talk a little bit about mechanical harvesting. And first of all, when did you come to Lake Alfred, and was that a specific assignment of yours, or was that an interest you developed?
I came to Lake Alfred in November of 1965. Herman Rice hired me. When I got here, I basically had two assignments. One was to continue with the air shaker, or I call them air shakers. Some people call them air harvesters, but I call them air shakers because they shake. They don't harvest air.
Right.
Anyway, Pierre Dutra, who was my predecessor here, he now lives in Canada, and he worked with Glenn Coppock. They had started an experiment down at actually right near the Bach Tower. I think Coca-Cola owned the property at the time. So they had started an experiment and they wanted to run it. You know, most experiments we ran in mechanical harvesting were for 5 years to try to demonstrate the effect on the tree, you know, and yield. That's really the bottom line we were concerned about. We didn't care too much. Well, we didn't care. And Glenn and Scott Hedden, they were the ones that started that because they were here when I came. Of course, Glenn started the project really in '57, but we always wanted to do it at 5 years to try to determine the effect on the tree yield-wise. But anyway, that project was ongoing when I came. I think it had been going for a year or two. So Herman wanted me to continue with that. And then the other thing I was assigned to was work with Bob Brooks on spraying. So those were the two main areas I was assigned to.
Now, on the air shaker, was there a design, or I mean, how far along really were they?
Well, at that time, and I've got it, I think, in the website, it was a old speed sprayer that was mounted on a pantograph lift system. It was made by Lico in Lakeland. So you'd run by the tree at the bottom height, then you'd lift it up, back up, and you'd run it by the tree at the top height. And like I say, it's in the website, a little short video of what it actually did. So, you know, I ran that and you know, completed the experiment and published the results. And you know, those were back in the day we didn't have precision chemicals or anything. You just ran it very slow ground speeds. And
now, was there a lot of interest in the industry to do this, Jodie? Was that the stimulation for it, or when Glenn started back in, you said 57?
57. He was hired by the Department of Citrus to, you know, the industry was concerned about the labor situation. When I got here, you know, I think it was 1966, you know, the production was 100 million boxes of oranges. And people really got excited about, well, we're going to have enough labor to pick all this fruit. Well, this was before Walt Disney World, and most of the labor was local. You know, you didn't have a bunch of Mexican people coming here to pick fruit. So they were, you know, genuinely concerned about if they had enough people to pick the fruit, mainly processed fruit, because, you know, a high percentage of our crop is that way. So that's the reason it was really started, and that's the reason they hired Glenn to work on that.
Okay. Now, some of the early work that Glenn did was with limb shakers, and some of the first mechanical harvesting was people who had those hardship trees to pick and use limb shakers to snatch them off, right?
Well, Glenn started with actually platforms and selective harvesting where they could put a man in a tree and pick. And I think that's pretty well documented. He was trying to improve the productivity of the individual picker, and they ran quite a few studies, different types, but the bottom line was you couldn't improve the productivity of man enough to pay for the device you had to put out there to put him in a tree. And so that's the reason they went to limb shakers, because they just felt that was the most, I guess, optimum approach to deal with the situation at the time. You got to remember, as you said, the trees at that time in the 60s and late 50s were the big trees in Lake and Polk County. You didn't have anything down south to deal with. And, you know, that's why, you know, like Jack Sherrard, you know, Glenn worked with Pounds Motor Company, Hoyle Pounds, he was still alive then, and Russell. I probably had more interaction with Russell, but Glenn worked with them. He gave them his own design out of the shop here, and they, you know, they manufactured, I think, 6 of them. And I guess Jack was probably the one that ran it most up in the Winter Garden area.
George Howard probably was.
Yeah, George Howard, they had one.
Yeah.
So it was really to deal with the situation at the time. You know, the big trees, and some of them were, you know, like Libby. No, even Charlie Russ, I think, was up there then. You know, the big trees, some of them were 50 trees an acre, 30 feet apart. So those were huge trees. You know, some of them would yield 30 boxes.
It was a massive undertaking, and we people save things, and Fred Saunders at R.D. Keene saved some picking ladders, and we moved them from their shop in Winter Garden. They're getting ready to tear it down, and had to get a guy to bring a 35-foot gooseneck trailer to load up 4 38-foot picking ladders to move them into Winter Park to storage. And so, you know, we're talking about how in the world can a man, you know, use a 38-foot picking ladder and climbing up and down that thing with 70, 80 pounds of fruit on his shoulder. So
Yeah.
that was a massive undertaking. Let me, you know, you started before the days of abscission chemicals. So was that an afterthought, or when did abscission chemicals? When did that become a possibility?
Well, I forget. I don't know what year Bill Wilson was hired here. It was in the early '60s. I'm trying to recall whether I think he was already here when I came. But you know, we recognized early on, because Glenn and them worked with limb shakers in the early '60s. And they, you know, most people realized you couldn't harvest all the fruit without something to loosen the fruit. You know, you could get, you know, basically a good nominal figure was 90% of the oranges off with a limb shaker. And, you know, everybody said, well, you know, if we could loosen the fruit some, maybe we could get it closer to 95 or 100%. And that's basically the reason the abscission work started, was to try to improve the efficiency of the shakers. And, you know, and of course, some people use it even with hand picking, but not much. I mean, it was and you know, one thing that I did when I came here, FMC had their speed sprayer plant in Ocoee, and 2 people are deceased now. Pat Patterson, who's chief engineer there at the plant, and Glenn Routh. They worked on the air shakers with FMC, and built some monsters. And I worked with Glenn actually in Burt Roper's grove up on Avalon Road there. Because, most people realize we got to go to smaller trees there would be successful mechanically. And so I worked with FMC for several years on their machinery, trying to help them improve what they had. They had I don't know if you ever saw it run, they had a air shaker catch frame system. It had a neat catch frame that had a unit in the middle that would ran on a chain, and it would had a bunch of panels that would try to keep the fruit, because you had running a catch frame on both sides of the tree, kind of like the oxbow machine now. And you had a panel out in this whole set of panels, and that's the one that you had to have a rider on there to index that blank panel into where the trunk was. And it was a pretty effective machine, but you used a lot of fuel to run that thing. You were only running maybe 1/8 or a quarter mile an hour, and you had to go down one side of the tree, go around, and come back on the other side.
Now, I don't think FMC ever had any for sale, did they? I don't.
No.
Ever, that was all just prototypes and everything.
The last machine they built was a unit we ran here in Orange Coast Grove quite a bit with Precision Chemicals, and they didn't have a catch frame with it anymore because it wasn't really. Used catch frames and Precision Chemicals are really a tricky deal. You could never arrive on the proper day without having a lot of fruit on the ground if the Precision Chemical worked. If it didn't, then you could do that, but that was always something. I think I always felt like the growers really didn't understand, or the people on the harvesting committee, and I'm not being critical of them, it's just that we did enough of it, because I worked with the Precision Chemicals, the one that they just turned down, release, the guy that with Abbott Laboratories that had it here locally. I think in 1970, we had experiments over here on Lucerne Park Road. So I worked with that stuff until I retired in 2002. Same basic chemical.
And that's the one they're still trying to.
Well, they really, I don't know what the deal is now. AgriSource was going to develop it, and then the DOC decided not to fund it because there's some, with the government, you never know what the next test is going to require, and the money situation, I guess, was such that they just didn't have the money to fund it. I don't know. I don't really know because that was after I retired, and I went to. In fact, I took Glenn to several of these meetings. He always liked to go just to listen, and before he passed away.
Yeah, we got close, but never did get the label. So I think
well,
Department of Citrus gave up on trying to keep put money in there.
I'm not sure the Department of Citrus made a mistake, but back in the 80s when it had all the freezes, that's when Glenn and Scott retired, because they were, I think, frustrated. There wasn't much fruit. The industry wasn't willing to support mechanical harvesting because there wasn't much to pick. And at that time, the Department of Citrus was pursuing registration of that chemical, and they just dropped it because there was no interest in it. So I don't know whether they made a mistake in doing that, but that's what happened.
Okay, well, it seems that we moved from trying to pick hardship trees and shaking it and big trees to more of a philosophy in moving large volumes of fruit, monitoring tree size. The air shaker came in, and we also had some wild things that came along. Dick Toole came up with the water cannon that was a different take on getting the fruit off the tree, and but there was a lot of interest in mechanical harvesting, and it I think has evolved quite a bit. I was involved or saw a little bit of the work that took place with Jim Simpson and his air shaker. Tell me how that went and how you were involved. It was
Well, one story I have about Jim and his dad, Howard. I built an air shaker here in the, I think in 1973 or 74, I don't remember the exact year. And Jim, you know, he couldn't wait to come down here and see the machine. And I had it out here, you know, Coca-Cola used to own all the property north of here. We call it the North 40 area, but it was basically the Grove area north of here. And they were very kind enough to let us run a lot of tests in their own machinery. But I remember when I took the machine out of the shop, it was a, you know, pull behind deal, 3 fans, same design. And, well, Jim took my stuff and had his made, the fans and all. But I remember when I took it out for the first time out here at Coca-Cola run it, Jim and Howard, Jim, well, he was the main instigator. He wanted to come down and see it. So I said, yeah, you can come down and look at it, Jim. I don't know whether it's going to fall apart or what's going to happen. But it was fairly impressive, I guess, at that time. And I just remember Jim saying, I'll have to build me one of those. And Howard said, why? We don't know whether it's going to work out or not. Well, Jim, you know, I think his dad always felt like he was running an experiment station in Fort Mountain Door anyway. But I said, well, Jim, I'll give you all the information I have. You can build one if you want, but I can't guarantee it's going to work out. But he was just all fired up to do it, and he did it, you know, he did it.
Did you ever go up there when he was building it? Go ahead.
Anyway, you know, Jim used he used, you know, Release had an experimental use permit for quite a few years there in the 70s. And so the people were doing mechanical harvesting. Most of them were using it, you know, to help loosen the fruit up some. But you know, I was up there a number of times when Jim sprayed it, and he used his air shaker to try to get most of the fruit off. He had some pretty good, you know, they weren't taller than a machine, but they were pretty big trees.
Well, you know, my experience is that growers have areas that they like to go to. Some are entomologists, and they really like the bugs, and they keep up with, do some good work there, and others are into nutrition and fertilizer. And a number of them are frustrated ag engineers, and they're drawn to equipment, and they don't necessarily have the formal training, but they see things and they like to make things work. And Jim was one of those, I think, a frustrated ag engineer. He liked equipment, and liked piddling with that and doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, it was, you know, the difference between his machine and mine was you know, he drove the fans hydraulically rather than, I drove mine directly with belts off the engines, but that's really the only difference.
Well, I had a more than a casual interest in that, and I didn't live far from Jim's barn, and so I would go by there at least once a week, and I'm trying to find some of the guys that did this, but Jim's technique, and this is just my observation, Jim's technique was that he found craftsmen in that area, mechanics, welders, these people that had the ability to do what your people did here. He took your blueprints, and he bought a GMC truck frame, and he started putting that thing together. And these guys would get together after work, and they'd sit out there in the shop, and you could only just kind of picture what's going on. He's got a cooler of beer, and they're joking, they're putting things together. But I watched this thing come from the ground up, and he got the 2 fans on the bottom that had the belt driven, and the other one was going to be articulated. So then he put a hydraulic motor on that. But I got the idea that you were basically his consultant, that he would be calling you, checking up with you all the time.
Well, you know, I never did go up there when he was actually putting it together. I mean, he called me a number of times to talk about different things, but I didn't really go up there. I was up there after he got it built, and because, like I said, Adair and I had some tree spacing and mechanical harvesting experiments all the way from his grove all the way to LaBelle. We had 10 experiments. They were a combination of mechanical harvesting and hand picking. We were trying to compare it, but we were also looking at tree density. And Jim had a neat grove there, out there where his dairy, I guess that old dairy barn was. It really were good producing trees, but he had them planted pretty close together, and I think it was 25 by 10 or something. So he let us thin some of those, you know, and so we had an experiment there with him, and he was a neat corporator, you know, he's just so far up there, but it wasn't any further than LaBelle going the other way.
But it was interesting, and they did get the machine built, and they did.
Oh, yeah.
Now were the rakes and the pickup machines, were they?
Well, the rakes and pickup machines actually were started here. Harold Sumner, who's worked for the USDA and is now deceased, he moved back to Georgia after he worked here. But he built a tractor-mounted rake that they used up in the Winter Garden area before FMC built theirs. It was basically it was a hay rake. But you know, FMC got interested in this because Disney was coming into the picture in the early 70s when they bought the property up here, and they were siphoning off all the local labor, a lot of it anyway, to build motels and build Disney and whatever. So really, the growers got really concerned about it, because I can remember a meeting, I think it was 1971, and the pickup machine was built here. I got the first pickup machine here. FMC gave me an old potato harvester that they weren't using. It came from Alabama, because we were getting to realize that to use the chemical, probably going to put the fruit on the ground to be effective. And so they gave me an old potato harvester, and I brought it down and cut the stuff off that needed for potatoes, you know, put a conveyor, an elevator on it to get it into the goat truck. And, you know, it's the same basic design that, you know, had a cleaning belt on it. Same basic design that FMC ended up building. So they took basically what we had here in the rake and the pickup machine and built it up there at the speed sprayer plant. I think they ended up building 15 of those sets, you know, the rake and the pickup machine. And, you know, basically I think they worked pretty good considering the conditions they were under. And, you know, I know the pickup machine, because I dealt with it most, if you could get the chain in the sand, it would pick the fruit up, and really with very little damage. The rake sometimes did damage, because I mean, if you had 600-700 boxes an acre, you had a pretty good windrow of fruit there to try to put it all together.
But the rake and the pickup machine were actually commercially manufactured by FMC.
Yes.
Based upon the work that you had done here and
yes.
developing and everything.
FMC took the rake idea, they put it on a self-propel unit, and I just remember, I think I put it on a sheet I sent to you. Raymond Kirkland with Likes, he operated that thing up there in what they call a mountain above Mineola there. He run up and down the road, and well, it worked pretty good. You know, those trees there were pretty close spaced, and I remember him running that thing a lot up there.
Well, Jodie, were there a lot of people that were building backyard machines? I would get calls all the time at the office with ideas, but you must have spent an awful lot of time dealing with people who had off-the-wall ideas. Or
well, Glenn, Scott, and I spent a fair amount of time with people who come by here. They want to talk to us about an idea they had, but a lot of it had to do with just gadgets that would help the picker. You know, tubes or something you could yank the fruit out of the tree with, and I just remember Glenn, and I used to do the same thing. You know, I was lucky we had Coca-Cola's groves here locally, and they said we could use them for whatever. We'd just say, okay, you got an idea about an individual, help an individual, take your idea up in the grove and use it for an hour or so, and then come back and talk to us. Well, that would usually solve the problem, because they found out it wasn't as easy as they thought it was. You know, if you had to look up or do anything and handle something manually, it was hard to do. You know, we had a couple of platforms here from California that worked reasonably well, but the problem was, it gets back to the same idea, you couldn't, most of the platforms, people started out with an individual thing to help person get into the tree, elevate him and so forth, move him around. Well, then they say, well, we can't make it pay off unless we put more people on there. So they had to expand it, and I know the one in California would hold 10 people, and they'd pick on each side of the row, so they'd go down each middle. But the problem with those things was always, you couldn't keep everybody busy all the time. Some people would be busy picking fruit, and the person on the other side might be in a part of the tree didn't have anything, or you couldn't get to something in the tree. So when you looked at the whole operation, it just wasn't effective enough to get enough production out of it to pay for the unit, you know. And, you know, to be really honest about it, since most of our fruit was processed anyway, this would only really be valid for fresh fruit. And, you know, it's like the guy, Frank McKinnon, had 50 of those one operator deals over on the Fellsmere area. I don't know if you ever saw one operate, but I've got a short picture, maybe a video on my website about it. But, you know, those things were $100,000 machine. You had one man on there. It counted the fruit, and the fruit were in neat shape, but when you look at the bottom line, you had to have a host of mechanics to keep all that stuff running, and it just didn't.
I think there was a fleet of them up in Umatilla.
Yeah. Well, it may have been at one time.
At one time, and they were one person operated, but they were self-propelled.
Yeah.
And
the operators,
they'd leave out of there, and they'd head out the road across the lake from my house, and it sounded like, you know, Patton was moving out his tanks, and they moved out the road.
During the freezes, they used those things over this area to trim trees with it quite a bit.
That's exactly what happened. But if I remember correctly, that was a deal where there was a tax shelter involved with that. They had investors that bought that, and you could write off the machinery, kind of like the early days when we had, you could have a 5-year depreciation schedule on the citrus tree, and we got all kind of non-citrus people buying groves, not because they wanted to grow, but because they wanted a tax shelter. But I had heard that this was an adventure where someone had sold off the idea of using this equipment as tax shelters. But you're right, they never really picked much fruit, but they pruned a heck of a lot of trees after the 83 and 85 freeze.
Well, you know, I think Glenn dealt with Frank more than I did, but I was over there a number of times, the Fellsmere area, and they used in a grove over there, I don't remember how big it was, a fairly large grove, but it had these furrows, water furrows that were just really tragedy. You know, some of them were probably 8 or 10 feet wide, they had water in them, and the average picker, it was a hazard to get on a ladder, and because the slope of the bed was such that it was just tough to do it without falling off or the ladder getting dislodged and you falling out of the tree. So they really made a big deal out of it over there because it was probably the place for it to be used, because the guy could pick, not have to worry about the ditch. And I remember, you know, in the 80s, there was, after the freezers started coming, there just wasn't any interest in mechanical harvesting. And then in the early 90s, Mike Taylor came here one time, and I think it was 91 or somewhere along there, said, Jody, you know, would you mind taking another look at mechanical harvesting? Because he could see what was coming down the road with all the production down south. But initially, the committee, Ed Smoke was on there, Ben Abbott, I don't know if you ever knew Ben or not, he was an extension guy here, but, you know, and of course Ben was over here at Haines City at that time, but they didn't want me looking at anything mechanical. They wanted me to look at anything to help improve? I said, well, we've been through that before. I said, I'll do it, but I said, it's not going to be that productive. Well, I went through that 2 or 3 years. We dropped fruit on the ground, did some different things, and it just nothing panned out. And then, eventually, I think it was like 93, I got a call from Marty Lasers. I put his name, I sent to you, the Jewish people called me one day and said, we'd like to talk to you about mechanical harvesting, and I met him in Sebring. I sat down, and he had taken all of our publications and gone through them thoroughly. Said, we've got a trunk shaker catch frame system we think will work. And they started out in Jack Berry's Grove there east of LaBelle, and I just said, well, you got a lot of guts to do this, because a lot of people have been down this road, not with trunk shakers, but just the mechanical part. And I said, and he was very confident they could accomplish that. Well, they did. They made 10 machines, and they, I think, were able to run like 9 years before they went bankrupt. But it had a lot of neat features on it. It's just that, and I have to say this, Jack Norris, who was with Turner Foods at the time, was very cooperative. Jack was a very progressive guy, I thought, and he let them operate in their groves for a number of years to kind of get the kinks out of the machine. And really, at the time, it was a kind of state-of-the-art trunk shaker catch frame system. They had some trouble with the shaker, but it was pretty neat concept for those smaller trees down there. But the issue was, and I did quite a bit of work on trunk shakers myself in the late 90s and before I retired. Because I ran one 5-year study with Joe Davis's groves. In order to get adequate fruit recovery, you had to have a fairly long trunk displacement shaking, low frequency. And of course, when you did that, most of the growers could see the roots coming out of the ground. Normally didn't shake it more than 5 seconds, but still, something that disturbed them. But the test I ran in the Joe Davis Grove, there's very little difference in yields in 5 years between those and hand-picked groves. And actually, we took some bark off. That was one of the problems with the trunk shaker with blenches, not with the other varieties, but blenches. And, I thought it still had some merit to it, but then, Oxbow came along with their canopy shaker, and when Cole had the trunk shake catch system, they ran, it was probably the most successful down south. I think they had 10 units, and I thought Lyman Cole was the boss man, and he always was very secretive about his stuff. I got to measure some stuff. I was always interested in measuring what was happening at the trunk. How much displacement do we have? What was the shaker doing? Try to relate that to tree damage or what was going on. But his particular machine, I thought, was probably the best overall trunk shake catch system. It just very durable, and of course they had a lot of experience in California. That's where they mainly operate, on pistachio nuts and prunes and that sort of thing. They had a lot of experience building them. But a trunk shaker for citrus is a lot different than a trunk shaker for almonds or pistachio nuts or whatever. The size of the shaker has to be considerably larger, and the frequency that you run at is a lot different.
Well, I think that we've evolved now that we understand that mechanical harvesting needs to be in a high density situation. If you can't, get 2,500 boxes a day or something with a mechanical harvester, that it's not going to work. So we've evolved there, and I guess that we still would be mechanically harvesting some fruit if it wasn't for greening in the situation with those trees.
Yeah, I think I haven't been down there. I used to go down every year and visit the guys just to see how they were coming along, the Oxbow people, but I haven't been down there for a number of years now. But I did talk to Bill Barber not long ago, and he said he thought they were the only one that's still operating. You know, they bought an Oxbow harvester, and he said a lot of people fuss about damage to the trees, but he said I don't see that much difference in stuff we shake with it and what we hand pick. And I like to go down there sometime to see, but I haven't been down there. And you know, one of the problems with the Oxbow machine compared to trunk shakers, that you basically got to have a fairly full closed canopy for it to be effective. You have individual tree canopies, you know, if there's any individuality to the tree, then it's hard to get that machine to get enough fruit off the tree. And really, that's the bottom line on all the machines. They can't get a high enough percentage of the fruit without having, you know, most of the guys wanting somebody to come by and pick up what's on the ground, get what's left in the tree, maybe not all the way to the top, but what they can reach from the ground. And by the time you do that, you negate the advantage of mechanical harvesting. And you know, the other situation with those machines is you got to have a fairly sizable acreage even to move it in there, like probably 1,000 acres. They don't want to go to a 100-acre grove in Polk County, or it's just not economically feasible. By the time they have to move it. And so yeah, those machines are fast. They have a big capacity, but they, you know, they're limited in where they can go, and you know, I know you're going to talk about this, but you know, one of the big limitations is blenches. They were never able to demonstrate, and the people in Immokalee were supposed to run some tests. I never read the results, but on the blenches, they thought they could harvest blenches, you know, when the little fruit were up golf ball size, but I don't think anybody was able to ever demonstrate that they could do that, you know, without reducing the next year's yield. And of course, they lost the precision chemical, which probably would have helped some. But you know, we used to kid Bill Wilson about this all the time. you put the, you know, regardless of how good you spray the tree, there was always some fruit on there that didn't loosen up. I mean, it's just the biological nature of the thing. And we always kid him about the 10% that never did loosen up. The first 90% would come off easily, but the
Yes.
last you really had to shake it about as hard as you would shake it anyway. And I don't think Bill liked it particularly, but that's kind of the way it was.
That was the reality, wasn't it?
And that was part of the deal with the chemical. You know, we made a lot of measurements on trees, with, you know, sampling the fruit, pulling force, and it was always my theory that you start out with a tree initially, it has some high pull force fruit, some low pull force fruit, and you spray it, assuming you get everything covered, and the whole thing is just going to come down to a certain level, but you're still going to have some fruit on there that is not going to come off very easily. But you get in a situation, if you're trying to use a catch frame, that the stuff that has a low pull force is going to drop off first.
Yeah.
And if you got enough of that on the ground, you know, what do? You
defeat your purpose.
Right, you defeat the purpose. So.
Well, mechanical harvesting went through a lot of ups and downs. I know at one time the agricultural unions and caused USDA to discontinue any effort on mechanically harvesting stuff because it was going to take away jobs and so forth. But to me, it's just been a fascinating story, and people like you that have seen it go through the various stages, and I want to talk to Charlie Russ. He worked with Jim Buttram, and there were a few commercial ventures that tried it, and who knows? I believe the first cotton harvester never picked much cotton, did it, Jodie?
No.
The second generation usually has incorporated a lot of improvements into it.
Well, toot my own horn, you know, Citrus Systems, which, you know, Jim and Charlie ran, and Don Block was the engineer. I think he still lives in Claremont somewhere. You know, they use the same fan design that Jim sent. One I had, you know, here is the 3 fans, and drove them all hydraulically, and you know, of course, it's all putting fruit on the ground, picking it up, and there's a, you know, I remember when I first started working on mechanical harvesting up in Winter Garden area, you know, we'd get these responses at the harvesting committee from the people in the plant didn't like the mechanically harvested fruit. And my response was, well, let me go in there and see what you're talking about. But there was a lot of resistance to us guys working in the field on machines to try to harvest it, to get in there and see. I wanted to see for myself, what is the problem there? And it was, they didn't want us in there. You know, eventually got into the plan, but there's a lot of resistance to us being in there. So that was kind of an interesting thing, competition there. They didn't want us being around because they wanted to protect their own secrets in there. And, you know, occasionally you get a rock in there that you picked up, but that didn't happen too often. Of course, that would play heck with an FMC extractor pretty quick, but, you know, I always said if you grade it properly with hand graders, you wouldn't have that. But
Wouldn't have that. Well, you know, and there for a while, Jody, if we lost a little bit of fruit, it was probably going to be good for us because we had more than we could sell, and now we want every darn orange that we can.
Right, yeah.
So you know, we're not going to be quite as enthusiastic about doing something
And,
mechanically.
you know, one thing that always interested me, because, you know, we reported to the harvesting committee for the Department of Citrus for many years. Glenn and Scott and I go to meetings and tell them what we were trying to do. And of course, I got a lot of support from the Department of Citrus, you know, the bill stuff and buy stuff. But I remember one time I was doing a test up with Likes between here and Claremont, and we had some blenches up there that got frozen, and they were talking about, we don't let any fruit on the ground get in our plant. We don't allow that. Well, I was up there one day, and probably 20% of the fruit had dropped off the tree. And the next time I go up there, there's no fruit there. The pickers had picked it all up and put it in. You know, that was one thing. What they would say at a meeting and what they had their pickers to do. If they could get by with it, they would probably do it, you know.
Yeah, those kind of things are interesting. It's like when there's a short supply of fruit, pack out, you look at fruit coming out of the packing house, it has a whole lot more blemishes than when there's an adequate supply of fruit and everything. Well, we're going to talk to some other people. Maybe we'll get back and visit with you, but then we'll put this thing together and let's take a look at it as we try to tell the story. But thanks for coming in, and thanks for the list of folks to track down. I talked to a fellow, and I forgot his name already, that works with, it was with BC Cook early on, and they did some mechanical harvesting. In the last part of his career, he spent in the processing area, and I think he's with Citrasuco here. And we're going to talk to him about his experience in the Grove and also in the processing plant. Like you said, what was the reality there, and was it a matter of the processing plant not doing a very good job of scheduling, and then wondering why they've got fruit sitting, mechanically harvested fruit on the lot for 4 days and expect it to be handled?
Well, you know, that was one of the problems with the precision chemical, particularly in blenches. You know, if it was hot, you know, you couldn't let that stuff sit in the truck for a day or two. It needed to be run through fairly quickly, depending on how much chemical you put on and all. But, you know, we ran into that down in LaBelle with Jack Neiske. We put a bunch of chemical on, and I think they had like 6 trailer loads, and we had to stay there. I know Glenn did, and all night long they were grading that stuff and trying to salvage what they could, because, you know, the chemical did enough damage to the peel. And if you let it lay there long enough or stay in the truck, it's going to rot. So it wasn't all peaches and cream about using the precision chemical.
No, Act A could really work on the peel of the fruit.
Yeah. Well, Release did too. I mean, Release did a number on it. So.
All right.